Okay, good day, all of you. I am Peter Alden. I'm here with Dr. Edward O. Wilson, a famous biologist at Harvard University, and welcome all of you who care about the life and work of Rachel Carson, who published a book that you may have heard of, whether you've read it or not, called Silent Spring, about 50 years ago today. Ed Wilson has been heavily involved as a spokesperson for biology throughout the world and biodiversity, and has written the afterword on Silent Spring in recent editions from Houghton Mifflin Publishing in Boston. So good day, Ed. Tell us what Rachel Carson meant to you.
Well, you know, in order to understand what Rachel Carson contributed and why she's justifiably today an icon, not just for this country but for the whole world, you need to understand what was going on in the late 1950s. And I know it vividly because I was doing the basic work then, a large part of it, on fire ants in the South. And it was a crazy time. It was a time when we were at the absolute peak of national optimism and self-regard. We'd settled, you know, the greatest generation was still with us running things. We had stopped communism in Korea, we thought, and everything was just turning up roses in America with industrial growth and expansion of education, and it really looked good in the late 1950s. But that optimism spilled over into an incredible disregard of the environment. I'll tell you just a little bit of a story if I'm not taking up everybody's time too much. I was, at that time, that was right in the early 60s, while, you know, Carson and the beginnings of the anti-toxic destruction of America was underway. I was on the committee of the National Research Council prepared a report on the proposed second canal across the Isthmus of Panama. It was to be a sea level canal, and it was a serious proposal. In those days, it was bad politically too, because we could almost choose a Central American country we wish to build it in, and then tell them, lucky you, we're going to build a canal across your country.
Arrogant Americans.
Oh, this was the age of the ugly American.
Oh, yeah.
We learned a few lessons since then. But at any rate, this was announced, and you know, we were on our way to planning it. Well, how are we going to build a sea level canal? You will remember that the main Panama Canal is stepped, and you have locks, so you bring the ships
up to Toon Lake, and the salt waters don't mix.
Well, it's not that, it's that the Pacific Ocean is higher than the Caribbean, so you have to take them up by steps. But that didn't bother the people who were going to engineer the sea level canal. What would be done, they would plant a series of nuclear devices, low-yield atomic bombs, across. I'm serious.
Really?
This is not. I'm not joking about
atomic energy.
Across the isthmus at that point. And then I guess it probably, say if it had been Panama again, it might have been
Nicaragua.
A great ceremony in which everybody gathered, and it was on all television sets, and both flags were flying side by side, and the heads of state were standing there, and the signal would be given, and it would go whoomp, 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 whoomp. And the water would flow from the Pacific into the Caribbean, and a little bit of digging and excavation and shoring up the sides and so on, and the ships would begin sailing through. Well, we biologists on the National Research Committee were asked, well, what effects might this have biologically? So we quickly pointed out that there are there's an entire fauna of marine organisms, shallow marine organisms over on the Pacific side, different from the one on in the Caribbean, shallow marine, because those two major marine domains have been separated by 5 million years of evolution, which we would eliminate in one shot. And if that happened, then you would have an admixture, mostly in the Caribbean, of faunas of both sides, although some Caribbean would get into the Pacific. And, you know, in those days it didn't impress people too much either. The nitwits who were running the corporate world at that time. They said, well, I guess the reaction would have been, well, you know, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal, fortunately, included sea snakes, extremely venomous sea snakes, and a virulent hydrozoan, a jellyfish, found only in the Pacific, which would now populate the West Indies. And it was the tourist industry which got wind of this that really started raising.
The Caribbean, West Indian tourist industry, with sea snakes swimming around all the people at the Sandals Resort.
Oh yeah, well, anyway, exactly. I've talked on too long about this, but I wanted to tell you that was seriously being considered. Another project that the geniuses had lined up were building harbors in places like Alaska. You know, don't worry about a harbor. We just blow it and make it. Well, anyway, the insanity reached another peak in the area that caught Rachel Carson's attention, and that was.
Well, she worked, her first few books were on the ocean and seas, so she might have been very against
well, I'm sure.
Canal.
I think she would have been.
To DDT. And
I'm not clear to what that she knew about it, because I would have told her if I had gotten together. But at any rate, the big thing about one of the things that caught her attention was the fact that the imported fire ant had begun its spread out of Mobile, Alabama, and I was a person who, at 13 years of age, discovered the first colony.
You're kidding, really?
No, in vacant lots. Oh yeah, and I'd learned so much in my teens about the fire ant. I was studying ants, that when I was a 19-year-old senior at the University of Alabama, I was hired by the Department of Conservation. Yeah, they've got one in Alabama to do a complete study of the fire ant, which I did, and I even published a little monograph on it as it was in 1949. By the late 50s, it had spread widely, and it was causing a lot of damage. It really was. It had a population peak, plague, but it was just another insect pest, basically. And it was spreading east and west. Clearly, it was going to cover the entire South. But it already was far into the Panhandle, and it was already well into, by the late 50s, I think by that time it had reached Louisiana and maybe even Texas, spreading. Well, in the late 50s, early 60s especially, this had caused quite a ruckus. And the plan was devised by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to eliminate the imported fire ant. It was called the Fire Ant Eradication Program. And the way it was to be accomplished was that planes would, duster planes, would spray chlordane over all of the range of the imported fire ant. I'm not exaggerating.
That's a lot of chemicals.
The chemical companies were ecstatic. But it was already planned. They had no conception whatsoever of what they would be wiping out, or even any threat to human health. And I think that's one of the things that must have triggered enough alarm in Rachel Carson. I don't know really what the background was to the writing of her book, but that was a kind of madness that we had. This was a
chemistry will solve all problems. Poisons will protect our food supply. It'll get rid of all pests. It'll solve all human health problems. The more chemicals you throw at anything.
So, Silent Spring was published at exactly the right moment, and it hit like a thunderbolt. and it brought to a halt a lot of this as people started thinking then.
Now, Paul Brooks at Houghton Mifflin, who was the editor of Silent Spring, and really fought hard to do it. Our mutual friend Peggy Brace in Concord, the Bluebird lady who helps us with so many different things. She knew Paul Brooks then, and socially, etc., and said that Houghton Mifflin was threatened by various chemical companies of major lawsuits to shut down a very huge publishing company here in Boston, with also an office in New York, if they published Silent Spring. But he held his ground. Thank you, Paul. And Houghton Mifflin published a very significant book. I know it's a tough read for anyone who hasn't taken high school or college chemistry, and it wasn't just DDT, it was a lot of other things. But in seeing these birds falling out of the trees down there on Powder Point in Duxbury by one of her correspondents, triggered her to change her focus from the ocean to the birds. But in saving the birds, in the great laws and the strides that we made to ban some of the more dangerous chemicals, I think she sort of saved humankind somewhat by really reducing the amount of toxic chemicals and man-created poisons in our own systems and so forth. But I noticed in a recent study that where they've checked the tissue of every penguin, they checked in Antarctica, there's DDT and other similar compounds in the fat of every single penguin in Antarctica 40, 50 years after we banned DDT in America. Apparently some of these poisons are still being used in a lot of countries with far less controls, far fewer regulations than we have in America. But in saving the birds, she may have saved mankind because of all these chemicals building up in everything from mother's milk to livers and every other tissue in the human body. So I think her significance is not just she saved the birds. She may have done something to help save mankind and put some red flags in our head about misuse or overuse of a number of chemicals, and some chemicals we just cannot allow. Very significant, even beyond the birds.
I'll buy into that. When you go to tropical countries, even today, you often have a dilemma because it was these same chemical insecticides, which in countries like Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, resulted in a dramatic decrease, for example, in malaria by mosquito control. So the trade-off there was a trade-off. Mm-hmm. Plus even more lax regulations in developing countries that allowed, maybe still allow DDT to be used. However, what should have been done is to see as soon as the revolution against these contaminants and toxic substance began against them, to assist developing countries in finding alternative ways to reduce malaria. For example, in Africa, $10 a person buys you a mosquito netting, a bed netting, $10. And it's been shown that that dramatically reduces the rate of malaria.
The mosquito really only comes out at night, is my understanding. And so if you can sleep under a mosquito net, I mean, you can still do your agriculture, your shops, whatever you're doing during the day. And if you can stay indoors, protected with repellent, or sleep under a net, and I know there's some nonprofit out there who's really into providing a mosquito netting for every individual in Africa, and I think that's a wonderful thing to do.
That's right.
Sometimes there are chemicals that are needed, as you say, for human health. There are some benefits at sometimes, and I notice in my work on invasive alien plants, some proper licensed use of some herbicides is important to solve some problems. So I don't want to be against all chemicals at all time, but just bring common sense into it. But I think another wonderful thing on Rachel Carson was that she was a female, and that she dedicated herself, and she decided she was going to make a difference in the world, whether she's male or female, it doesn't matter, but every individual on the planet, in addition to whatever they, things, responsibilities they have with their family and their jobs and so forth. It'd be good to have a cause of some sort that is positive for the future of not just humans, but all life on Earth. And I think Rachel was a real inspiration to many females, sort of at the time when the women's movement was really gathering steam. And having female heroes, I think, was very important, in addition to the fact of her work being very important for all of humanity. But I think it has empowered many females to take action in something that they strongly believe in and can make a difference in. And so I salute those who are saluting Rachel Carson today for all she did to help the environment, help the birds that I care about so much, but just helping the whole environment. I know we use too many chemicals on lawns and agriculture, et cetera. But to just the blanket, what you were talking about earlier about just spraying like 5 states along the Gulf and the South Atlantic there, every square inch with some of these poisonous chemicals, I mean, it's outrageous. And we look what happened here in Massachusetts in our attempt to kill, I mean, I remember growing up in Concord, or attempting to grow up unsuccessfully, the trucks going along the street with these big fogging things hitting our sugar maples in front of our house in Concord, and airplanes dropping the chemicals from the sky against some mosquito, and then eventually against the gypsy moths. And boy, have we lost the whippoorwills, we've lost, even the ruby-throated hummingbird was impacted, many birds are impacted. And of course down there in Duxbury and Powder Point, and Lisa Hutchins' place, Terry and Judy Vose have done so much to protect, the spring house it's called. The birds falling out of the tree, but that was probably malathion or something like that rather than DDT. But just an impressive body of work that this one woman decided, I'm going to make a difference. And in her dogged pursuit, she did make a difference. And I'm very proud of what she's done, and I'm happy that we're here to honor her today. So thank you, Ed. Any other thoughts that you might have on your interactions with Rachel Carson and her work?
Well, just to add that, of course, this protest, that's what it was, a protest, came at the beginning of the 60s. And I think it gave a lot of people in a lot of venues help give them courage to protest. Yeah, and that's the hallmark of the 60s, and it brought in a great many changes that have transformed society in a very good way.
The industrial military complex, they've done a lot of good, but you've got to have some controls, you've got to sandpaper some edges and so forth, but it was part of the 60s culture, and she was part of the 60s culture, and I think the world is much better off that Rachel Carson was part of it. So thank you very much, Ed, for saying a few words on Rachel and her significance, and hello to all of you out there. Thank you for watching or being present in honor of Rachel. Thank you.